Welcome to READ, the Research, Education, Advocacy podcast, where we connect you with researchers, thought leaders, and educators on topics in research and best practices in education and child development. READ is produced by the Windward Institute, a division of the Windward School, and I'm your host, Danielle Gomez. Yes, big news in my personal life. I not only graduated with my doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, but I got married over the summer and finally changed my name. So it's wonderful to greet all of our readers around the world after some exciting celebrations. And speaking of excitement, I'm just filled with inspiration for this month's guest for our 50th READ podcast episode, Dr. Sonia Cabell. Dr. Cabell, welcome to READ. I'm so excited to see you.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on all of your news. That's exciting.
Thank you. I mean, we got married, I guess this episode's coming out in November, so July 22nd of this year. And I was talking to some of our colleagues and I was like, how do I announce it on the podcast? Well, should I just say it and just move on? But, you know, it was an exciting thing to say. And I know some of the READ podcast listeners always check in about my doctorate work or, you know, another personal celebration. But other than that, welcome for being here. I hear that you have joined me on READ podcast tea time. So I brought my mug.
Let me see your mug.
Mine says, birds have wings, humans have books.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And mine is a shout out to University of Virginia. It is like this beautiful saucer, like teacup and saucer from University of Virginia. And I did my doctoral work there at the University of Virginia. So wonderful place.
It is a wonderful place. I've learned so much from the University of Virginia, as I've learned a lot from Florida Center for Reading Research and FSU, where you are now. Before we get started, I just want to know, how are you showing up to this conversation and where are you in the world?
I'm in the midst of writing a grant right now that's due tomorrow, or maybe it's due Thursday, but for me, it's due tomorrow. So I'm a little bit crazy. I'm showing up a little bit crazy, but feeling good. I'm excited about life and I feel like I have the best job in the world. I get to ask questions I'm curious about and then answer them and try to help people. So I feel like I have the best life.
I love that so much. And speaking of curiosity, sometimes when you hear people like out in the field saying, oh, you know, this piece of thought leadership, I attract really well to people that are curiosity leaders as opposed to thought leaders. And so when you said you're driven by curiosity, it's, you know, I already feel that energy there. And to give our READ listeners some context, I did say it's the 50th episode of the READ podcast. And one of the themes, I think, from READ is this sense of integration of research, education, and advocacy for all children, specifically spotlighting areas of reading education and reading research. And I've truly just learned so much from so many conversations, other curious people in the field about this aspect of child development and reading through a holistic and comprehensive approach. And with reading specifically, I've come to, again, this integrated lens from the brain and its processes, how we think neurobiologically, how we look at it in the classroom, this integrated approach to classroom instruction, and then thinking even beyond, right, the communities and beyond. I talked to one of your colleagues, Dr. Lakeisha Johnson, about ecological approaches to reading, and more recently with Dr. Yakov Petcher on whole child processes. And so a lot of this is just fuels my curiosity even further. And then secondly, I have been thinking a lot about translation science and more recently getting into implementation. And so I think what our READ listeners will really get out of this is how do we know all of this research and you spent so many decades just on this area of expertise, and how do we now apply it? What do we do now? And so that's my long diatribe to then how I'm going to introduce you. I know a lot of our READ listeners know a lot about you, have learned from you. You've been out in the field, but I do like to give some space for a formal bio. So Dr. Sonia Cabell is an associate professor of reading education in the School of Teacher Education and the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University. She has also worked as a second grade teacher and literacy coach in Oklahoma and Virginia. Dr. Cabell's research focuses on early literacy instruction with a particular interest in the prevention of reading difficulties. She has authored over 60 publications and has been an advisor for a variety of national organizations and state departments of education. We will have Dr. Cabell's full bio, including titles of books and some articles that you've authored on the Read Podcast website. So readpodcast.org. So let's dive into the conversation.
Okay.
So Dr. Cabell, can you tell us your story, your professional background? And if you have some personal inspiration, I'd like to know more about your journey to where you are today.
Yeah. So I think my journey in education started really early in life because my parents, they immigrated from Pakistan in the 70s, and they always stressed on us the importance of education for all aspects of our life. So education was so pivotal in so salient in my life. And so I knew from when I was really young, I wanted to be a teacher, or an astronaut. But I gave up, or the new kids on the block. But I kind of gave up other dreams and stuck with being a teacher because I always had it in me to want to help others learn and grow. And I really felt that reading specifically was important for all things and for all areas of life. And so teaching people to read became very important to me. But it wasn't really until I had my own second grade classroom that just really started becoming more important to me. I had a student who couldn't read, and I couldn't help her, and I didn't know what to do. And in fact, I was using kind of methods that I know now wouldn't have helped her, which is really sad. And I know that sometimes teachers who've been teaching for years, have been reporting when they learn new things, they're like, oh, I've taught this other way for so long. And it gives them a lot of grief, right? But I think when we, know more and know better, we do better. And, but I couldn't understand why she wasn't really learning. We were doing kind of flashcard drill, and she wasn't retaining any of the words, and I didn't understand how to help her. And so I just continued to, I went to school to get my master's in reading and then continued on to get my doctorate in reading. I just was really interested in this area. So that's kind of how I got into it in the first place is education being very, very important in my life, and then always wanting to be a teacher.
I love that. That resonates a lot with me too, because I felt this passion growing up for teaching, and teaching reading is such a purposeful vocation, right? It's something that's lifelong. It's ingrained in us, I feel. I'm curious. So when you started your research at UVA and then you went to FSU, how did you get more invested in early childhood or even worked with vulnerable populations of students?
Yeah. So I, after I was a second grade teacher, I was a reading first coach. So this was the early 2000s, and it was the reading first, no child left behind time period. Mm-hmm. And I was in Oklahoma, and then I was in Virginia. And in Virginia, I saw a newspaper article with Dr. Marcia Infernizzi's name on it. And she had written a book called Words Their Way that I had used in my classroom. And so I was so interested to meet her. So I got a chance to meet her. She's the one who kind of told me about doctoral work. And I had no idea what it meant to get your doctorate. I had no research background. And so I started learning. And when I was in the program, I met Laura Justice, who's now at The Ohio State University. She was my advisor. And I think meeting her and spending time working on her research projects really changed my life and showed me the value of prevention of reading difficulties. If we can make a change early in a child's life, a small change, it can have a big impact later on. So that's when I began to see that. And that's where my research, under her training, my research became focused on the early childhood space and preschool. And then now my work goes preschool to about grade 2. And I stayed at the University of Virginia for many years as a researcher up until about 2017. And then moved to the Florida State University and the Florida Center for Reading Research in 2017.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that through line of the journey from not only teaching, but the focus of area of research. And I appreciate what you said about even just the small change in early childhood can make a difference. When we think of children in early childhood, I mean, where I am at the Windward School and the Windward Institute, the the Windward serves students with language-based learning disabilities like dyslexia. Think of dyslexia as a primarily word reading difficulty, phonological deficit. And there's also a spectrum of reading difficulties that children can have, talk about even purpose. I have several members in my family that have a reading difficulty that doesn't necessarily mean it's dyslexia, but it could mean in language deficits and things like that. And so it wasn't really until I got to Windward where I started to see the spectrum of reading difficulties and the methods that were actually effective to teach students with reading difficulties. And these were methods that were necessary for those students, but benefited all children. And so that brings me to my next question about reading development. So your research focuses on a number of skills needed for reading development with a particular emphasis on early childhood, as you said. And I had said in my introduction about these integrated approaches to reading. And what I find fascinating about your research is that you see this comprehensive through line, particularly in oral language, background knowledge, and writing. And so when we were talking in our pre-interview conversation, it was really hard for me to sort of like actually verbalize all the thinking that I often, wake up in the middle of the night dreaming about. So when you think of things like oral language, background knowledge, and writing, do you call these interdependent, integrated? I mean, how would you characterize the way these skills are related?
Yeah, I have been talking about integrated literacy and content instruction as methods that purposefully integrate these two. A lot of times in the K2 space or the pre-K2 space, this integration happens through oral language instruction and exchanges. In the later grades, the texts that students are reading are also part of this integrated approach. And researchers have been studying this approach for decades now. I'm certainly not the first to study this, and I won't be the last. But when I think about that integration, and the reason why I think about that content integration with language is because I think about the ways that it potentially can change the language learning environment for young children and eventually children's language skills, which are foundational to their reading development. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my work, if you think about the Simple View or Scarborough's rope, a lot of this work, this integrated work in the pre-K through second grade space really is in the language comprehension part of the rope.
Yeah, I like that. I think when we think about language, we had instructors at the WI, a lot of the focus that we have also at the Windward School is thinking about language as the vehicle for instruction. Dr. Lydia Seufer, who's a speech language pathologist, says, and it really, truly, it's the foundation, right? When we were talking yesterday, I think you had referenced Nell Duke when she talked about instructional simultaneous. Was it Nell Duke?
Yeah, it was Nell Duke in our handbook, the handbook on the science of early literacy, which I edited along with Susan Newman and Nicole Patton-Terry. Nell had a chapter in that book that talked about instructional simultaneity, where she talked some about this oral language and knowledge integration, but also talked about other areas that can be integrated throughout the day for young children. And I think that taking advantage of integration, it's not just about saving time. It's also about what is it about the integration of these areas, of different areas of instruction that give students more bang for their buck. That's the kinds of things I like thinking about when I'm thinking about integration of knowledge and language. And you mentioned writing as well. And when you think writing can be integrated with knowledge and language as part of the responding to the knowledge that's being built. Writing can also be integrated with decoding because those spelling pieces of writing early on are quite synchronized with their reading, word reading development. And so depending on what aspect of writing, those can fit in multiple places.
Yeah, thank you. And I like how you brought all those together. And so I want to get a little more granular and dive deeper into these areas. Okay. So starting with oral language. And I mean, I often get frustrated because we can all recognize the importance of language, right? In all academic and social aspects, right? As a teacher, I've learned about language, form, content, use structures, pragmatics. But how do we even capture the importance of language? And let's just bring this to the forefront. In what ways does oral language contribute to overall reading, particularly in the early grades?
So when I think about the contribution of oral language, I think about as foundational for reading in general. So there's studies that show that oral language relates to later reading and it has its greatest impact on the language comprehension portion of reading. So the language skills that students develop early on end up impacting how they are able to understand the texts that they're reading. So reading comprehension. And then, however, language also relates to being able to decode. Mm-hmm. For example, if I don't have a word in my mental lexicon already, and I go to try to decode that word in print, and I don't know that word, how am I supposed to read that word? No amount of, I could sound it out, but if there's nothing to match it to. So oral language is not just for language comprehension, but it's also for proficient word reading as well. And so I just think about it as kind of being the underlying piece for all of it. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I do too. And as you were talking, I also thought about language underpinning word reading and, as you said, language processes, and then also background knowledge and content knowledge. When you were talking about if you don't have the mental lexicon of a word, right, that's language and that's also background knowledge, right? And right. So, yeah.
So when you think about vocabulary, a lot of people have, think about the differences between vocabulary and knowledge. And it's really tough sometimes to separate what those differences are. I think that there is a difference. I think that you can have knowledge but not have the language for that knowledge. However, that they're really intimately tied together. So some people think about vocabulary as just being like the tip of the iceberg, like what you can see and measure of a more conceptual knowledge underneath. Mm-hmm. And so that's especially true if you think of the content kinds of specific words you might be teaching rather than the more general all-purpose kinds of words, but the more content words. If someone has, I like to think of it like a spider web. So if a spider has made this beautiful, intricate web, mm-hmm. and let's say a concept is in the middle of that web, let's say winter, because, you're from Florida, right? And now you're in New York. So a child in Florida might have a really different idea of what winter is, and their web might be looser and less well connected. Mm-hmm. Whereas the child in New York might have a really tight and intricate web of what traditionally winter would look like. Yeah. At least in the US. And when you add new knowledge, when you go to read a book aloud or listen to something or read something, a tight web that has connected ideas will catch new knowledge, right? Whereas a loose web things might go through like the poorly formed web. Yeah. So when you think about that with more complicated or more complex topics than winter, for example, you can see how, I might know a lot about one topic, but have no knowledge of another topic, right? Or very little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oof, I'm now like drawing that depiction in my brain. I love that. I love that analogy. And when you talk about background knowledge, and we know that it's not even current or recent. Background knowledge has been an important focus of reading comprehension. I think it's getting a lot more focus just from popular discourse and truly it really is getting the attention it needs. And you have written a lot about the importance and benefits of content-rich instruction to contribute to background knowledge. And again, before we get to the specifics, what do I do in my classroom tomorrow? I want to just bring it to the forefront of intentionalities as a teacher, right? Before even a child enters the classroom, what should we be thinking about some barriers and facilitators to children, either A, bringing in background knowledge, and then B, building that in the classroom?
I think we have to understand that children are bringing in background knowledge. All of them are bringing in background knowledge, whether it's about topics that you're going to teach or not. They're bringing some knowledge to the table that they've acquired over their life. They're not blank slates coming into the
Right.
classroom, right? And so some of their knowledge might be valued and some of it might be less valued in school. Some of it might be more relevant to school, might be less relevant to school. I think one thing to recognize is getting to know students and their background and their families to understand what kinds of knowledge might they have that you can connect with their families and with them, because
Right.
they might know about certain topics, but not others. So just that awareness that different people bring different knowledge to the table.
Mhm.
Second, if we want to build a base of knowledge in the classroom, we need to often think about how do we provide students with knowledge to then build new knowledge on. So how do you provide them with background on a particular topic in order to build more content knowledge on that? And when I use the term background, so background knowledge, we think about it as it's the knowledge that you bring to a text, right? So when you're
Mhm.
reading a text, the knowledge I already have about that topic is my background knowledge.
Right.
When I say content knowledge, I am using that. I use that rather synonymously because that's the kind of knowledge. There's other scholars bring up other kinds of knowledge that are important for building. But I think about that importance of that science and social studies knowledge. And how do you build that? So not everybody's going to come to the table with the same amount of that knowledge.
Right.
And just understand. So I think the first point I was making was about, valuing the knowledge that they bring.
Mhm.
And then the second point is how do you, to teach them something new, how do you make sure that they have knowledge to learn that and then build on that thing that you're teaching them with new knowledge?
Right.
And then go back to remember when we learned this, and then explicitly make the connection for them on the new knowledge.
So I love that. And you're already getting into some classroom tangible practices. When you were talking about connecting what they already learned, a lot of this and what I really like is reading research is bridging with decades, even more, I don't know, maybe
Yep.
nearly a century of cognitive psychology of building schema, right? And so, and among a variety of interdisciplinary disciplines in psychology and truly neuroscience and all the knowledge we've already bring in. So before I get off the diatribe there, sometimes also I get into like a research nerd, like, let's go down this road. And I'm like, no, pull back because, we only have so much time together, even though we could probably spend half a day drinking our tea, cheers.
Right.
I have to stay the course. So we'll stay the course on classroom. So you talked about building knowledge and then connecting to prior learning. So what are those tangible practices that teachers can implement to continue to integrate, whether it's content-rich instruction or just to continue to build in background knowledge?
Yeah, so my colleague, Heijin Huang, and I did some work around this, and we did some meta-analyses. And meta-analysis is just a study of many studies.
Mm-hmm.
So we looked at all of the experiments and quasi-experiments that existed. Quasi-experiment just means that the treatment and control group were not randomly assigned. And we looked at those because those are types of research designs that give us some evidence toward causality, that this thing caused this other thing to happen. So we were looking at integrated approaches that in K-5 that, that were efficacious, meaning they had some impact on vocabulary and comprehension. And we found some common features among some of them. They were varied approaches, and they weren't all very few of them were like curricula that were available. Most of them were lessons or, lessons that were created by researchers for the study. But they had some common features that I want to share with you. And those were things like they planned the units around science and social studies topics. So this was in English language arts, okay? So I'm talking about English language arts. So traditionally an English language arts curriculum plans the units around the ELA standards. But we found that these English language arts curricula or English language arts approaches that were content rich were actually using content knowledge as the chief driver of instruction. And they were hitting all the ELA standards. But they were really focused also simultaneously focused on the content. Another thing that they did was they used conceptually coherent text sets that were ordered to in some way to build knowledge, whether it was knowledge, these things varied to how long they were, how deep they went, but a set of texts were used that in the younger grades, students were, that were read aloud to students and that teachers used to instruct. And they were interactive read alouds. There's been a lot of research on the importance of that interactive nature and the conversations around the read aloud. And then the third thing, so again, planning units around science and social studies topics, using conceptually coherent text sets ordered to build knowledge. The third thing was that the discussion and the writing in that ELA instruction was focused on building knowledge. It wasn't just focused on, I'm going to ask an inferential question or I'm going to find the main idea. It was focused on building knowledge. And then teaching relationships among the words was the last one, was that words were selected and those relationships among the words were taken into consideration such that you can build networks, those kinds of spider webs of words, versus other ways of selecting are might not take into consideration the connection among those words. So those were some of the features of the content-rich English language arts instruction that seemed to be different than a lot of typical English language arts instruction has been in the past.
Those are really interesting. I have a little notebook that I'm just writing vigorously in, actually. It's like, take a sip of tea, write vigorously. But to synthesize what you were saying, I really like how you outlined those features. It seemed to me that coherence was really important in terms of content and also the coherence between language building and vocabulary was included, content knowledge building, and then that writing connection, which is, I think, is interesting. And so in the meta-analysis, I know you said it was focused on building content. Was there an integration, for example, of skill building and knowledge building? Like as they were teaching knowledge, was there also, skill building in terms of, we have to say
strategies?
Yeah. And I don't want to say strategies because, sometimes no, we're not isolating the strategies, but what I'm asking is, as you're reading a very, a text, let's say it's a science-based test on photosynthesis, was there some skill building and strategy in summarizing that was also coherent in that?
Yes, it varied across the different studies, but some of them had strategy instruction also in place. So it wasn't an either or thing. It could be a both and thing. I think about how do you use the strategies in the or how do you use those skills in the service of building knowledge?
Yeah.
So when you think about why you're having someone summarize or find the main idea or whatever it is, those are important and those are important to teach explicitly. We have research that shows that's important. We don't want to throw out research that shows something works, right? But however, I think about how do you put those two things together in a way that will help children. Not all programs have an emphasis on the comprehension strategies, but certainly some of these approaches definitely had both going on. I do think that this would be a great, researchers who are listening out there, this would be a great area of study, is which kinds of strategies and which kinds of knowledge building kind of go together really well. So that can, that can inform that.
Right. I like that what you said. And it reminded me of a conversation. I've had a lot of conversations with researchers on this topic and with educators as well, and amongst our colleagues. Speaking of instruction in general, I thought about when you talked about vocabulary and making networks of words. I talked to Dr. Margaret McCowan about this, about the yes and an integrated approach to explicitly teaching vocabulary and making sure that students were immersed in building networks of words so that it wasn't just this one isolated time, but they were also getting a lot of other exposures. They were connecting in text. They were connecting with writing. And that gets me to writing. I'm so jazzed about writing. I know that you are too on this reading writing connection. What were those elements of the reading writing connection that continue to facilitate content and comprehension in general?
Some of the examples, and I want to say that the Marty McCowan and Susan Newman, some of your people you've had on are just the most top-notch experts in the field on this on the topic of vocabulary, and so I feel humbled to kind of be here talking about this. But some of the examples that we saw in terms of how children in K2 approached writing in these content-rich English language arts instruction, writing was always a response to what was being read aloud to them or what they were reading. In my colleague, Jimmy Kim, he's at Harvard University. He is, his work is amazing. Among my most favorite work is the work that he does with in this space of content, of integrated content and literacy instruction. And in his approach called MORE, he has students, he said it's like a PhD for students, for first graders.
Yeah.
And they are engaging in research projects and inquiry and thinking about learning about Arctic animals or some sort of topic. And it's not just about the Arctic animals, it's about a larger schema of like survival. And so they are researching these things and then writing about these things and have a lot of agency in that. And so the writing that they can produce as young children might be surprising,
right,
and might make us think, wow, I didn't think kids could do that. And I think when children have the motivation to and see why it matters, that it's not just writing that doesn't have a purpose or is just for the teacher to read, but the writing might be for something else. Nell Duke also studies the project-based learning and approaches. And the thing about that kind of approach that's really compelling is the writing. This is also an integrated content and literacy approach. The writing becomes like a product that they're going to show people if they want to. For example, maybe they are trying to solve the problem of like the playground needs some repairs, and how do we talk to how do we solve this problem of getting the repair? And and so maybe they might reach out to local city council and try to, so young children are coming up with these ideas and then enacting them. And so it's very meaningful. And so I think about the approaches that I think seem really successful in incorporating the writing are the ones where children want to have something to say, want to say it, and are supported in saying it, have content that they're saying, and it's meaningful.
Right. I love that. I heard meaning. I heard creating agency, right? I mean, what an amazing idea for children to see a problem that's happening in their neighborhood and then acting upon it, right? There's something that's really powerful about that, especially through writing. So what I've heard in terms of I'm a teacher thinking about content-rich instruction, integrating language, vocabulary, and writing is the intentionality of coherence, making sure that knowledge builds on each other, really identifying those rich vocabulary words and making networks and connections with that, and then prioritizing reading, writing. What other, in terms of oral language, and maybe you want to talk about read alouds, or maybe you want to talk about a different direction, but what are some other practices for boosting something more like language or even content writing?
So it's interesting that you asked this. My colleague Trisha Zucker and I just finished working on a book that's coming out with Scholastic. Mm-hmm. And we talk about having back and forth conversations in pre-K through first grade is the scope of our book. But if you think about the conversations that are going on in the classroom, these become important, pivotally important for children's language development.
Mhm.
So there's been a lot of great research about how interactive read alouds matter for children's language learning. It's not just the content of the book that they're hearing, it's the ways in which they're engaged with the book in conversation. So what back and forth conversation allows, and we encourage people to strive for 5 conversational turns, a term that David Dickinson coined in 2003. I say something, you say something, I say something, you say something, I say something. That's 5 turns.
Yeah.
Okay. And we encourage teachers, and you'd be surprised at how often conversations stop at just 2 or 3 or 4 turns and don't go back and forth. But when you have a back and forth conversational exchange, might be able to ask you an open-ended question that elicits a response from you.
Mhm.
Then I might be able to take your response and build on it and push you further, maybe asking you another question that deepens your thinking and provide and get more abstract or cognitively demanding talk from you. I might give you feedback that is more corrective in nature. Let's say I asked you a question and you didn't know the answer, and I might give you a little scaffold that helps you. I'll say, is it this or this? And you choose one or the other. That's one example of a downward scaffold. I'm also able to, as we go back and forth, I'm able to model language for you. So something that my son still says, he's in 3rd grade. I think by now these should drop off, but a child might say, "I winned the game." And you say, "Oh, you won the game. Good job." Right? So with young children, you aren't saying, "Okay, repeat after me. You won the game." Okay, say that. You're not stopping the flow of the conversation there. You're having them hear the model, and that model will change their language. So you might be so in a conversation, you can be addressing syntax, you can be addressing building background knowledge, um, verbal reasoning, which is like making conversation more abstract, more decontextualized beyond the here and now, more of the language of books, more cognitively challenging. You could be providing, so we talked about syntax, background knowledge, verbal reasoning, vocabulary. And so you could be covering a lot of different areas, and you could be teaching them something about the genre of the literacy genre. Those are all 5 areas of Scarborough's language comprehension strand.
Right.
Strands of that in the reading route.
I love hearing that. First of all, when does the book come out again?
It should be in December.
Nice. Well, I'll definitely be on the lookout to grab it, to buy it, purchase it. But I liked what you talked about specifically, how these are facilitating the global skills of Scarborough's rope, but then even getting down to the nuances I was writing of teacher questioning, of feedback, whether it's even that example of wind versus one, right? Because that was an aspect of corrective feedback, but even the way that you approach that, right? That it was a positive reinforcement of and also correcting that. I think that was such an amazing micro moment that you modeled there. And then the scaffolding piece. And these are all very prescriptive skills that teachers have to continue to build. And so just even facilitating or emphasizing the importance of that, I think, needs to be out in the forefront. So I'm really happy that you talked about that. Before we get back to our macro discussion of reading discourse at large, because we are getting to the end of our conversation, is there anything else related to the classroom or any of those micro practices that you'd want to share with us?
I just want to reiterate that it is important to keep those conversations going and try to have them, try to have a Strive for 5 conversation with kind of one student at a time. You can have conversations with multiple students, but also go back and forth enough with one student that you're supporting their language. You don't always want to be talking only to the kids who initiate those conversations with you. You want to look for the children who might have lower language skills, might be English language learners, and students also who might be shy.
Yeah.
You want to also make sure you're including different people. In our book, we recommend using equity sticks, and that's just like on a popsicle stick, like writing students' names down and call it, making sure that you're having conversations with everybody throughout, your couple day period, so that everybody is involved and nobody is kind of falling by the wayside. Because within a classroom, we often will talk to people who are like in our face talking to us,
Yeah.
but if you think about how those conversations serve as a vehicle for students' language development, it
Right.
can help you rethink. And when I think about this topic, I think conversations in the earliest years, especially, drive all of the learning, because students aren't able to necessarily read the text itself yet,
Right.
especially in pre-K or K. Those conversations are just absolutely critical.
Right. They're learning the sound structure of the language right there.
Right.
And even I actually was, when I had watched your TED Talk, right? Shout out to you giving a TED Talk. That's amazing.
Thank you. It was a TEDx talk. I don't want to make it bigger than it was. It was TEDx FSU. So it was at FSU, selected at FSU. And I really loved it because sometimes people will ask me, it's funny because that talk is all about spelling and reading and decoding. And I care about that very much because I spend a lot of time talking about oral language and knowledge. Sometimes people think I want to make sure people don't ever think I am disregarding the importance of decoding and word recognition. That's critically important, right? Just because I focus on this other thing more doesn't mean I don't find the other, decoding critically important and essential to reading.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, I mean, I think what's unique about your approach is that, again, there's this there's this network, and I'm going to say the spider web even, like, of all these different skills that are important. You referenced Scarborough Reading Rope throughout this conversation. It's been well documented in research too about the importance of word reading skills and then the higher and lower level language skills and how all those come together. So the reason why I had talked about the TED Talk too was even with writing and spelling is there's like the pre-writing phase, there's a pre-reading phase, and how important in those pre-reading and writing phases are for students to learn the sound structure of reading. So when they think about then marrying the sound structure, the phonological piece with the orthographic writing piece, right? Then you get that those are foundational pieces. And now I'm just thinking about the brain and how interconnected it is. I could just keep going, but I appreciate you talking about that. The one thing I wanted to say in comment about the classroom practices was that the importance of, and I like to think about it in terms of, now I'm just going off on a tangent. There's so much happening in my brain right now. Pause. For those of the people that are watching this and maybe listening, be like, where is she going? Okay. So as we do close for teachers, right? I like to conceptualize these practices in facilitating instructional language as proactive and responsive. And what I mean by that is as you're thinking about your classroom, knowing your students, right? What are the students bringing? What knowledge are they bringing? And what types of questions are going to facilitate that knowledge and then continue to broaden and deepen that knowledge. But then what are you doing in your classroom to continue to maintain that equity of responses? I liked how you talked about equity sticks. I often think about wait time is just being incredibly important for students who have language difficulties, or just in general, any student's going to benefit from wait time, whether they're shy, they have a language difficulty, or if there's that student in the front of the classroom who's speaking before they could even think, me right now, right? I know sometimes I need to take a sip of tea and take a breath before I can get into it because I am just, all my thoughts are flooding before I can even capture them. So I did want to circle back to the proactive and responsive practices and thinking how powerful it is even to write a list of questions out before you're teaching a read aloud book, or what I used to do in my classroom is write out some examples of feedback that I could potentially give a student if they are applying a correct vocabulary word or they're making a connection. So had to say that. Whew. Love
And a
that.
lot of times the curriculum will offer you that you have, the curriculum will offer you what is the guiding question that while I'm reading this book aloud that students should be thinking about. And you let the students know, we're going to discuss this at the end, but this is what I want you to be thinking about as we're reading. There might be some pausing points during the reading, but really we say after the book reading, have those Strive for Five conversations with students that go, that where you can ask them the guided question and they can respond to that. And so that those questions, definitely you said, those questions are things that you want to have planned in advance and be
Mhm.
thinking about the conversations and how those might unfold for you and how you might support students to help them grow in their language, no matter where they are.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I love that. It's such a great way to summarize even some of the things that are happening in my mind right now. So thank you for leaving us with that. Final question is, speaking of TEDx talks and conferences and podcasts, you are out in front and reading discourse. We are learning so much from you collaborating, researching, speaking across scientific and education communities. So from your expert perspective, where does the focus now need to be in not only what we're saying, the discourse, but how we're actually implementing this in practice?
So, I love that, this takes us back to that implementation
Hmm.
question that you mentioned at the beginning, because if we're not able to implement what we know from the science that works, then how useful is it going to be, right?
Hmm.
So I do think that one of the things in terms of a research focus, implementation science is a growing and a field in education sciences, to better understand how do we help, um, how can we partner together and implement the practices. And it's really valuing the teacher's expertise, the school, the practitioner expertise, and having the researcher and practitioner partner in ways that would, both would bring their expertise to the table and be able to work on solutions that would help that implementation. So that from a research perspective, I think that there's a lot about implementation in this content-rich ELA space, because some of the barriers of implementation are things like teachers say, I don't really know enough to teach it, like about science and social studies topics. And so what are the ways we can overcome some of the barriers? And what are things that are facilitators? So for example, when I think about facilitators, I think about, are there contexts in which teachers are already doing a good job, naturally with language interactions? And in my work, I found that the language interactions and conversations, such as science, teachers were doing more language modeling, kind of more naturally. So that's what made me focus on content as a facilitator of language. Like, can we improve the language in content rich contexts?
Yeah.
So I do think that, from a, I study where I think the field should go, right? All researchers do. We're curious about the things that we think are on the cutting edge. And I think that the integration between content and literacy instruction really needs to be continued to be thought about, and not just in English language arts. So right now the focus is all in English language arts, but rather think about, I think you talked to Hugh Katz.
Yes.
He and I have been talking about, why only in English language arts? Shouldn't we be boosting the science and social studies and implementing content and implementing ELA, into that? And I think the answer is yes. I think it's, how do we improve, how do you make your whole day coherent for children,
Right.
and for students, such that the knowledge and that they're learning across subject areas and their literacy learning, how does it all connect? And my colleagues like Hugh Katz and Nell Duke is creating a curriculum around this right now. And how do you really make it so that across the whole day, students have a coherent experience? I think
Yeah.
that's where the push should be, rather than um, but that's breaking down the siloed approaches of English language arts being its own textbook adoption thing, and science being its own textbook adoption thing. So, so there's a systemic change that would need to occur in order to adopt programs that would cut across a whole day for students in kindergarten and up.
Yeah. Two things. A, you need to come visit the Windward School. I mean, you have a
I would love to.
Yes, you'll see the coherence of reading and writing across a science teacher as a language teacher. And so that's the first thing. This is my formal invitation to you to visit the Windward School. And then two, I think it's an interesting conversation, maybe for another topic, another episode on coherence and textbook adoptions and different content areas. I'd love to pick your brain and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would be very happy, and I would love to come and visit the school.
We're a great time in New York, Dr. Cabell, I said I was inspired in the beginning. This is such an inspirational conversation. I'm so just delighted and pleased to have shared tea with you today. Thank you so much for being on the Read podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.